Shalom. My wonderful helpers are handing out a handout. I'm trying. Is that better? I'll try to talk loud. How about that? So the handout is just a reference for you all because I find it's hard to talk about timelines without having a visual. So that's there for you just if you want it. So today's Torah portion is the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, as we talked about. And we didn't actually start at the beginning, which is actually my favorite part. So that's what I'm going to talk about. This book is fascinating for so many reasons, but I want to highlight one of them today. So I'm going to start by asking some rhetorical questions for us to think about and see if you can answer them in your head. I used to be a teacher. I don't know if you can tell. So the first question is, so we know that this whole book of the Torah is one big speech, basically. So the first question is, who's talking? The second question is, to whom are they talking? And the third question is, when are they talking? So while you're thinking about those, let's talk a little bit about the history of this book. So according to Jewish tradition, this book, along with all of the other 4 books in the Torah, was handed to Moses on Mount Sinai by God. From an academic perspective, this book was likely written somewhere after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. So scholars place the dates for its composition anywhere from like the 7th century BCE up to the exilic and post-exilic periods around the 3rd century BCE. You'll see these dates on your timeline if you're curious. Notably, if we hold to the Jewish tradition of the Exodus, all of those dates are between 700 and 1,000 years after the speech in question. So let's come back to those questions that we started with. So who's talking? Moses. Yeah. So this is Moses' big goodbye speech to the children of Israel, sort of an I'm leaving, now you be good sort of moment. And according to the narrative, it was delivered on the doorstep of the Holy Land, right before Moses dies and Joshua takes over as the leader. This means we have one tradition that says that this book was written down on Mount Sinai 40 years before the speech was given. And we have another tradition that said that this book was written down in Judea about 1,000 years after the speech was given. So now we're going to add a wrinkle. And if you ask me, this is the really fun part. So in Moses' speech, and these are all quotes from chapter 1, which we didn't hear today, but it's fine. You'll stick with it. It's fine. So in chapter 1, verse 9, Moses said, "And I said to you at that time." In chapter 1, verse 19, he says, "The great and awe-inspiring one that you saw." And in chapter 1, verse 27, he says, "You muttered in your tents," and so on and so on and so on. But the people he's talking to weren't there when that happened. The whole point of those 40 years of desert wandering was that the entire generation died out. So all of this means that we here in 2024 are reading a speech that, depending on what you believe, was written either 40 years before it was delivered or 1,000 years after it was delivered. And although it's delivered in the second person, the people who were actually there for the described events were either recently all dead or had been dead for about 1,000 years. So this is what I find really neat about Deuteronomy. In the Jewish Study Bible, Bernard Levinson writes in the introduction to this book, Deuteronomy may well be the first book to pose the problem of modernity. Its authors struggled with issues conventionally viewed as exclusively modern ones, such as the historical distance between past and present, the tension between tradition and the needs of the contemporary generation, and the distinction between divine revelation and human interpretation. Here in Deuteronomy, we're seeing a beautiful example of what I believe is an invitation to radical time-bending empathy. This isn't the only place we see it either. In Exodus, we're told, "And you are to tell your child on that day, saying, 'It is because of what Adonai did for me when I went out of Egypt.' And in the Haggadah, we say, 'We were slaves, avadim hayinu.' And earlier this summer on Shavuot, we were reminded that all Jews, all of Klal Yisrael, stood together at Sinai to receive the Torah. We empathize across time and space, and we imagine experiences as though we stood in the sandals of those who were there thousands of years ago. Now, I think that's all pretty amazing. But what I find even more fascinating is the tension that this creates with another, maybe slightly less well-known ethic in Judaism. To talk about this, we're going to have to rewind all the way back to before the flood. Way back in Genesis chapter 11, the humans get together and decide to build a really, really big tower. And in verse 5, it says, Adonai came down to look at the city and tower that humanity had built. This verse brings up an interesting question. Why did God have to go anywhere? Shouldn't God have been able to see what was going on by virtue of being God without needing to come down? One interpretation might point out that the Tower of Babel story falls within a set of narratives that often anthropomorphizes God. This is the God who walks in the garden with Adam and Eve, who debates with Abraham over the fates of Sodom and Gomorrah, a God with many human characteristics who can move through space and exist in the world much like we do. But within a more traditional perspective, where the Torah is a single theological story, Rashi leads us to Midrash Tanchuma, which has a different explanation. Rashi tells us that although God is described as coming down to look at the city, God really did not need to do this. So why then is this language used? In Midrash Tanchuma, it explains that God descended in order to teach us never to render a decision against another or testify concerning any matter unless we have witnessed it ourselves. If God didn't need to go anywhere, in other words, then the fact that God is described as going somewhere must mean something. In this case, it must point us to a conclusion we are meant to draw about how legal proceedings ought to occur. We find a related story in Bava Batra where Rava is speaking to some of his students about how to interpret one of his arguments after his death. He says, "Do not tear it up, even if you disagree with it. If I had been there, maybe I would have explained it and changed your mind." But also he says, do not learn from it. Do not take it for granted, because a judge has nothing apart from what their eyes see. These stories come to teach us about the limits of the radical empathy we learned about a second ago. Can we imagine ourselves into the sandals of our most distant ancestors? Absolutely. And that act of empathy is crucial to developing our empathy muscles and internalizing that we must not oppress the stranger because we too were strangers once. But we must be careful, our tradition tells us, because although we can attempt to empathize with others, we must never judge what we do not experience ourselves. In the Yad Ramah commentary by Meir Abulafia, in his commentary on part of Sanhedrin, he discusses what it really means to use one's own logical instinct to understand and draw conclusions about an idea. Roughly translated, he says, I draw conclusions from my own knowledge and understanding. I listen to discern one thing from the midst of another thing, and to draw meaning and reasoning from my etzem, from my bones, from myself. Throughout these sources, we see that judgment is an inherently personal process. This is the opposite of justice being blind. This is a justice that enters the courtroom with eyes wide open, taking in everything, acknowledging biases on all sides, and judging from the deepest parts of our humanity. Drawing in our time-bending empathy, this is also a justice that must be constantly reminded of the experience of slavery, of being a stranger and an outsider, of being oppressed and othered. It is a justice that forces us to find a balance between identifying with experiences beyond our comprehension and yet always recognizing that those experiences are not our own. This form of justice demands personal experience and perspective, in addition to deep and radical empathy for others. And by reminding us that we can only truly judge that which we have experienced ourselves, it demands the inclusion of a grand diversity of voices in the crafting and discussion of Jewish law, Jewish community, and all of Jewish life. If we all judge from our own experiences, then every one of us is a crucial part of the story, and the broader Torah and wisdom of Judaism cannot be complete without all of our perspectives. Later on in our Torah portion, again, not the part that we read today, but a different part, Moses reminds the children of Israel that whenever considering a dispute among people, we should always judge with equity between each man and his brother or a foreigner who lives among you. The only way we can live up to this exhortation is, as we have seen, to hear the voices of everyone in our beautiful Jewish communities and to listen to everyone's experiences, to do our best to empathize with others, and to judge only those matters we have experienced ourselves. So I'm going to leave you with this question. What is it that only you can bring to our ever-growing community? What wisdom is uniquely yours? And how can you share it with others? Thank you.